In this short video, we'll learn about the general workflow in working with Redshift for Cinema 4D. Just setting Redshift as the render engine, adding a light source, adding a camera, assigning basic materials to objects, previewing your render interactively using IPR in the render view, and a final render. This lesson is for the people who are just starting with rendering and really don't have the slightest idea what the process is like. If you have ever done any sort of rendering, you can safely skip this lesson. I have already created a few objects in my scene. I have a floor plane and a simple sphere on top of it. The first thing you need to do is to define Redshift as your render engine, which we learned in the previous lesson. In the render settings, change your render to Redshift. Now let's create a light source. So from Redshift menu, go to Lights and add an area light to the scene. By default, area light has a rectangular shape. You can change the shape of your area light down here in the light attributes. Also, let's change the size X and Y of the light to about 75 centimeters. So we have a smaller light source. And now we can position the light so it shines at our subject, which is this simple sphere. Before adding a camera, let's find a good view. This looks good enough for a first render. Now we need a camera to properly render our scene. So from the Redshift menu, add a Redshift standard camera and look through it. Before rendering our scene, we need to also apply some materials to our objects. So in the Material Manager, go to Create menu, Redshift, Materials, and add a Redshift material, which is the main Redshift material. Double click on the material to open up its shader graph. Now I'm gonna zero out its reflection weight, so it's a basic diffuse material with no reflections. Let's also change its diffuse color from this mid-gray to a lighter gray with RGB values of around 175 and assign the material to the sphere. Next, create a copy of the material by control dragging it in the Material Manager and apply the new material to the floor. We can for sure come back to these materials later on, but first let's see what we get from what we already have. We can start previewing our render and adjust our lights and materials as we see fit. In order to do that, we can open up Redshift Render View. Now, if you click on this play button or start stop IPR button, we can start an IPR or interactive preview rendering session, which gives you a quick interactive feedback of what's going on in your scene. While we are in IPR, we can start adjusting different parameters and see the result in real time, which is really helpful. So the first thing you notice is that the image is a bit dark. Like in real life photography, we have two solutions. We can either increase our light intensity or adjust the camera's exposure. For now, let's select the light and increase its intensity to around 150, which gives us a better exposed render. Cool. Now let's work on our materials a bit. First, let's open up the sphere material, change its diffuse color to this purplish red color. To make the sphere reflective, we can set the reflection weight to 1, and to make it less shiny, we can increase its roughness to around 0.2. Now let's select the plane material. Here I want to use a texture to control the diffuse color of my material. So let's add a texture node and load this grid.png texture. And now connect the texture to the diffuse color input of the Redshift material. Just to make the texture smaller, I'm gonna set its scale to 3 and 3 and also rotate it by around 270 degrees so it looks better on our object. Now we are ready for our final render. Let me close the shader graph, stop the IPR and open up the render settings. To make sure the final image will be noise free, I can set the render quality to high and the output resolution is set to 2080 by 720, which is good enough for now. And now let's start the final render by clicking on this render button in the render view. And now the final render starts, and depending on your hardware, it can take a few seconds or a few minutes. This render took around 5 seconds on this machine. And here is our final render. It looks really clean. Yay, so that's our first render in Redshift. If you want, you can render the image to Cinema 4D's picture viewer. So let's do that as well. And here is our render in the picture viewer. For now, let's get back to the render view. Now we can save out this render by clicking on the save button from the file menu, choosing a proper output format like PNG or JPEG, naming it properly, and clicking on the save button. So in this lesson, we learned about the general and very simplified workflow when using Redshift as your render engine inside Cinema 4D. See you in the next one.